one of the things that's interesting, and for those watching on YouTube or on Spotify, you'll see the charts here. We'll try and describe it in audio as best we can. But what's interesting about quarterly changes in the hedonic dwelling index is there's a very strong bias towards the lowest quartile, the bottom 25% quartile. And largely, it kind of makes sense too if you think about it, particularly in Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth, where they are strongest, because you've got a banking system that has really pigeonholed people into these particular markets, largely because affordability or borrowing capacity suggests that I've only got this. Even if I have a desire to spend more than this X amount, I've only got this amount. So therefore, you're looking around the country. We've been doing that as a business, looking around the country for opportunities. And what I find fascinating, Ben, is I grew up in Perth. The very first house I lived in was in the southern part of Perth. It was in a shire of Kwinana. The first house I ever lived in was in a suburb called Aurelia. And that was a long, long way from the city, Ben. There was a freeway that came through, but it was probably more on the lower demographic than other parts of Perth. But that particular region, Ben, if you have a look at the latest data, has performed significantly over the last little bit. And if you think about what it is, it's because the price point allowed a lot of people in that market who wanted to buy at an entry level, if they were buying it with shelter as the main purpose. Well, clearly there was an affordability play that they could get into, Ben. But then when you think about some of the East Coast investors that were coming over who were also limited by borrowing capacity, it kind of made sense that these particular markets started to grow. So you can see that in Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth here, and just marginally Sydney, you can see that the growth was greatest in that bottom lowest quartile.
Yeah, so thanks to our good friends at CoreLogic who provide this quartile data, and Tim Lawless, a great friend of the pod. We did see that over this sort of period of time, 12.4% of that lower 25th quartile, that's the growth we saw over the quarter compared to the upper 75%, which is obviously the more expensive properties. We only saw a 3.8% growth. So for those new to the game, what normally happens is in a classic typical cycle, we see usually the more expensive markets leading the way, and then a ripple effect happening. So as a market finds its feet and it goes in through a capital growth cycle, it's usually that top quartile that starts to grow first. Then it ripples down as that sort of affordability and judgment calls are being made by consumers in terms of that whole sentiment and how they're going, and then ultimately what they can afford to buy. And so Melbourne, if you look at the current chart that we've got on screen, you can see it's in a classic down cycle, which is, you can see there, negative 1.8% for that 75th quartile. For the mid quartile, negative 8%. And then sort of for the bottom quartile, you're seeing a negative 0.1 of 1%. Now, if you then look at the Brisbane and the Adelaides and the Perth, which to Bryce's point are the moving markets, you can also see that these markets are in a cooling phase. Because if that was true about the uplift, then normally what you'll find is the top 25% quartile is leading the charge, then the mid, then the low. And so what we're seeing now is that momentum is slowing down in those particular markets. And that's what we talked about earlier in terms of, this spring selling season and talking to agents and getting that commentary and looking at our data. It's very, very clear that the supply side, which we'll talk about soon, has started to outstrip that level of demand. So we aren't seeing that same level of absorption. But when we go into a bit of a deeper dive shortly, we'll start to see how that's actually looking in our data sets when we talk about the market in general.